I survived the New York Ripper. I grab a morning paper from the newsstand on my way to work. He got another one, I thought, as I read the headline, New York Ripper claims another victim. That's 10 now. 10 young women snuffed out by this madman. It sends a shiver up my spine just thinking of it. The city has been in a panic the past 7 weeks since the first woman was found, with daily reminders from the news outlets to constant urgings from the police to be cautious when going out. No shit, Sherlock, I'd like to tell them. Don't you think every woman in the city with a proper head on her shoulders is frightened with the thought of running into the Ripper? I know I am. I've taken every precaution. I've followed every step they've told us to take when going outside. From not going out at night to always travel in twos. Never travel alone when possible. Hell, I even purchased some pepper spray. Just the same old they always tell you to do in these situations. I feel uneasy now. I always do after reading or hearing about the Ripper. As I continue walking to work, I look at any man that passes me with caution. I always do now. You just never know who the Ripper could be. Nobody even knows what he looks like. As I reach my office building, relief washes over me as I walk through the front door. I work with a bunch of sweet old ladies, so work has felt the safest place for me since this has all begun. The day was a typical work day, long and boring, of course with sporadic chit-chat from the ladies sprinkled throughout the day about the Ripper. That seems that's all anyone talks about nowadays when gathering in large groups. As the shift came to an end, we said our goodbyes and told each other to be careful heading home. As I walked out of the office door, I could see the sun was still out, which was great because I didn't want to be stuck outside walking at night. And it looked like it would be up long enough for me to run to the corner store on the way home to pick up some things for dinner. When I turned to walk towards the store, however, I noticed parked across the street from my office was a man sitting in a black van, just staring at me. I was spooked right away. This is exactly what I've been cautious of. Creepy and suspicious dudes. And this was a creepy dude in a creepy-ass van. And he was staring, just staring at me. And he was smiling. I ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back, but I could hear him start up the engine. I thought I could lose him in the traffic, though, as the streets and sidewalks were filled with cars and people getting off work. I felt safer when I got into the store. I got my things for dinner and tried to leave as quickly as possible, but the store was packed. I was in that place at least a half hour longer than I wanted to be. By the time I left the store, though, it was dark. This is exactly what I didn't want to happen, being stuck outside alone at night. But I was just a few blocks away from my house. It'll be fine, I thought. I just have to hurry. I began walking at a quickened pace. I didn't see the van, so I thought I was in the clear. As I got just a block away from my house, I approached an alleyway. I decided to run past it, but right when I was about to clear the alleyway, I felt a hand grab my shoulder and another hand cover my mouth. A man's rough, snarled voice whispered into my ear, "You're coming with me, bitch. You're gonna die tonight. But we're gonna have some fun first." He dragged me toward a dimly lit light. It was the back of his van. The doors were open, and I could see 2 bodies stacked on the side on the floor. I could see that the carpet was an orange shag. Actually, the whole inside of the van was lined with it. I remembered at that very moment the paper this morning saying that the only evidence found on some of the bodies was a couple of pieces of orange carpet fibers. My God, it's the Ripper. He's got me. I'm about to be the latest victim found in some ditch somewhere, I thought. As he got me to the doorway of the van, I knew I had to try something, or I'd be done. So as hard as I could, I slammed into his foot with my heel. He loosened his grip from my mouth, and it allowed me to bite into his hand. He screamed out in pain. I then turned and kneed him in the balls. And when he bent over in pain, I took his head and smashed it into the open van door. He fell to the ground moaning, and I turned and got the hell out of there, running all the way home. I called the police first thing, but when they got to the alley, he was gone. But I know what the bastard looks like, and now the police do too. It's just a matter of time now. You son of a bitch. The lottery. I woke up to the blaring sound of an emergency alert of my phone. It warned of an impending nuclear threat. Await further instructions, it said, as my phone screen turned black. My husband Tom woke up with a jolt next to me. What the hell is this? He asked, as he read the same message I had just received. Still in shock and confusion, I really wasn't even afraid. Not yet, at least. We waited in silence for a few minutes before another notification popped up on our otherwise inactive phones. Citizens of New York, please do not panic. We have fail-safes in place for an event such as this. The message went on to explain that there was an escape shuttle fully equipped to house thousands, a hydrophobic system, a waste recycling system. The shuttle was designed to evacuate us off the planet to a base set up on the moon, so they said. They called the shuttle the Ark. This has to be a scam, Tom said. Some crazy hacker, right? His voice sounded less sure with every word. Await further instructions, came the disembodied voice on the phone. Adrenaline hit me, and I sprung into action, trying to pack supplies we might need if this was real. But it wasn't, right? This can't be real, was all I could hear myself think, until my phone lit up again. Nothing but a green screen. Congratulations, the robotic voice said. You have been randomly selected for a seat on the shuttle. Directions will be sent to your phone. You have 1 hour to reach the docking station. Good luck, citizen. When I looked up from my phone, I saw Tom glaring at me. I realized then his phone screen was red. We're sorry. You have not been selected for a spot on the Ark. Your obligation to humanity will allow the survivors a chance to continue the species in the event of a full-scale nuclear war. We thank you for your sacrifice. What the fuck is going on? He said. I couldn't even find the words. I can't go, Tom. I can't leave you here. Sobbing on the end of the bed as I looked at the despair in his eyes. No, we're going. Maybe I'll find a way to sneak in, but I won't let you give up like that. He held me for a brief moment before the sounds of chaos erupted. Shaking violently, I forced my frozen body to look out the window at the complete desecration of society beneath me. I watched in horror as my sweet 70-year-old neighbor smashed a frying pan over her husband's head, picked up his phone, and ran. Two brothers from next door were clawing and biting at each other, wrestling on the ground over a phone with a clear green screen. "We need to go," Tom said. Without hesitation, I followed him to the garage. As soon as the door was open, a mob of our friends and neighbors swarmed the car. Stunned as my window smashed suddenly, showering me with glass, as Josh from down the street began trying to drag me out of the car. Tom floored it. Slam. Crunch. Screams. I couldn't look back, but I couldn't shut out the thought of the mangled bodies of our neighbors, whose bones I could feel crushing underneath our tires. The GPS on my phone began to speak, giving us directions to the Ark. I watched helplessly as sons attacked their own mothers, husbands attacking their own wives, teenagers, even children. The entire neighborhood had descended into complete madness. Gunfire, screams, blood, chaos. A waking nightmare. Tom floored it, daring anyone in his path. I had never imagined what panic could really do to otherwise sane and decent human beings. But this was a scene straight from hell. Survival, animal instinct. These people had become no more than the most primal instincts they possessed, willing to do anything to survive. Then finally, we found our destination. A cage, a maze, a series of fences guarded by the military. They were herding people through the gates like sheep. People trying to shove their way forward. I watched as children were trampled under panicked feet. I watched as the uniformed men opened fire. A man on a loudspeaker continued his warning, forcing the mass of bodies to fall in line. The guards were checking phones before letting anyone enter the gates. I listened in horror to the desperate cries of families being torn away from each other over nothing more than a green or red screen on their phone. Tom, I can't do this. How can I leave you like this? I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Whatever happens, I want us to face it together. I love you. He pulled me in, kissed me gently on the forehead, and held me. Then he whispered something in my ear. Forgive me, Maggie. Blackness. Instant blackness. Before I could even regain my composure, I was rolling down a hill, slamming into rocks, gaining speed until I finally reached the bottom. Hard. I heard the sickening sound of the bones in my wrist cracking. I couldn't believe what just happened. I reached for my phone. It was gone. That selfish, evil fuck. He stole my phone. The realization crushed me. I could hear a guttural scream from far away, yet I knew it was my own. Disassociation and adrenaline set in as I tried to claw my way up the embankment, only to continue sliding back down, watching helplessly as the man I loved, now the coward who betrayed me, appeared more and more distant as he walked towards the shuttle. I dropped to the ground in disbelief. I couldn't cry. I couldn't scream. I couldn't feel. Completely numb, I wasn't even afraid anymore. Having fully accepted my fate, I just lay there waiting for death. The only emotion I could muster was an insane, uncontrollable laugh. I laughed as I watched the massive doors close on the Ark. I laughed as I watched it powering up, getting louder and louder. I laughed as I watched it suddenly explode into thousands of little pieces and rain whatever was left of Tom back down to the earth. When I finally found the strength to move, I looked around at the world, screaming and sobbing, waiting, waiting, waiting. But the nuclear explosion never came. In the weeks to follow, we found out the truth. This event took place in every major city on the planet. It had been known for a long time that overpopulation would end humanity for good. But we all chose to avoid the thought, acting blissfully ignorant to unavoidable truths was something humans have always been good at. The ones who made it to the ark, to their promised salvation, were the real losers of the lottery, chosen to sacrifice themselves for those of us who remain. It seems the easiest way to take out such a large number of the population was to walk them willingly to their own slaughter, killing anyone else who got in their way. In my newfound sense of nihilism, I've pondered so many other ways the same could be accomplished. But it worked. It worked well. And with minimal damage to the planet itself, the planet that is now on its way to recovery. But here we are now, trying to rebuild the pieces of our own undoing, of the guilt and shame, of the gruesome murders and the deaths of our loved ones. We are the survivors, but are we the lucky ones? We will now live in a world of paranoia, a world where we know if it ever comes down to it again, it's brother against brother, husband against wife. Every fake smile and wave, every friendly gesture from a neighbor, a mask hiding something truly horrifying underneath. We like to think we are good people, but what are we really when being good comes down to something as simple as a red or green ticket to survival? The man on the train. I was about 21 at the time, living in New York. I had an interview in another borough. There are 5 of them, and you can get to each one via the subway or buses. It was about 4 p.m. when I finished my interview, and I was getting on the train to head back home. The subway was pretty crowded, seeing it was about the time kids got off school, and I was coming back from a pretty busy part of the city. I struggled to find a spot to sit because it was so crowded, but I finally found one, alongside an older woman, a couple of teenagers, and a very creepy and unsettling man. He was probably a few years older than myself, but something about him seemed off. It was going to be a long ride back to my apartment. I believe it was about 12 stops. So I put one of my earbuds in and listened to some music while I checked my messages. As the train became more empty, I had this feeling that I was being watched. So I glanced across from me at the creepy man from earlier, who was staring at me intently. I can't really describe how he looked, except that he had some very thick-rimmed glasses, seemed like he hadn't showered in days, and had these crazy eyes, and a very unsettling smile, like someone that just got out of a loony bin. Maybe I was over-exaggerating, I thought to myself, as I went back to listening to my music. I looked up again and saw him smiling at me, so I politely gave him a half-hearted smile back and broke eye contact, uncomfortable, ready to get off this train. The next time I glanced over, He was looking me up and down, as if I were some object, and giving me that terrifying smile again. It was very unnerving, and if it weren't for the few people left on the train, I'd probably be having a meltdown. Anxious and ready to go, I got off the train 3 stops from where my actual stop would have been, because I knew he was still watching me, and there was no way I was going to let him find out where I lived, or even what street. I glanced back to see he had moved closer to the window, watching me step off the train as it pulled away. I briskly made my way down the streets and took a detour back to my apartment. All the while, my heart was beating out of my chest. By the time we had made it to the stop I got off on, it wasn't even dark yet. But the thought of what this man might have done if I hadn't gotten off the train on the wrong stop still haunts me to this day. I know this isn't immediately scary, but for me, it definitely rang some bells. To the weird, creepy man on the subway who looked me up and down in broad daylight, I hope I never see you again. I think there's something on the ceiling. True story. So me and my friend are in our local bar. One of the bartenders is sort of elderly, very nice guy, and on quiet nights like last night, we get great chat out of him. We haven't lived in New York too long, and like hearing the crazy stories people like him tell. So tonight, my friend asked him, "What's the craziest story you have?" He replies that he has quite a few from working 9th Avenue back in the day when it was very dangerous. My friend then asks, "What's the story that first comes to mind?" He says he was working a weekday, and it's just him and another girl at the bar. The girl goes to the restroom and comes back and tells the barman that she can hear noises on the ceiling of the ladies' room and thinks there might be a large rat up there. The bartender's been working there a while and has never heard anything like this before, so he decides to go and investigate. The barman comes back, calmly picks up the phone, and dials the police. "Hi, it's Mark. Can you send someone here, please?" "Yes, it is." "Thank you." He said police were usually there in no time back in the day, and he knew them all on a first-name basis. "So what was up in the ceiling?" we asked him. He told us that up in the crawl space in the ceiling above the ladies' room, there was a man that he had never seen before, with a blade about this length, and he demonstrated the length of roughly 12 inches with 2 index fingers. After asking him how he knew he was there, he said that he noticed a man's blinking eye through a small gap in the ceiling. He played it cool, washing his hands and pretending he didn't notice, where in reality his heart was pounding like crazy. "Who was he?" I asked. "Don't know," he replied. "What was he going to do?" I asked. "Couldn't tell you," he replied. "You ever find out what happened to him?" I asked. "Nope," he replied. "You don't give much away, do you?" I said. "Boys, why do you think I'm alive so long?" To which we all had a light-hearted laugh after hearing this terrifying story. The reason I don't ride the New York City subway. I woke up after a particularly forceful bump. I came to the rattling of the train and the bright lights of the train car. I was fairly groggy and realized I still had my right earbud in. I quickly pulled my phone out of my pocket and tried to turn it on. It was dead, and the Bluetooth earbud in my ear had probably been the one that killed it. Realizing I must have been listening to music when I fell asleep, I put the bud back in its case and took a look around. There was no one in my car. The only thing I could see outside the window was the dark, damp walls of the tunnel I was passing through. I sighed and got up to stretch, pulling my arms out behind me and letting out a long yawn. Damn! How long was I asleep for? A quick glance to the left and right yet again showed no one. The other train cars, identical to mine, showed no signs of life. I noticed the floors were remarkably clean, strange for a train on the New York subway. I grasped one of the poles in the middle of the car and started to walk over to the window on the door to the right. Finding the conductor was my first step to figuring out what was going on. Just as I took another step towards the door, the train suddenly started screeching to a stop. I nearly stumbled because of the sudden decrease in speed. I felt a turn in the tracks, and before I knew it, the train was at full stop, the open doors revealing an empty train station in front of me. I hopped off, making my way up to where the conductor booth was. I tried my best to ignore the eerie creepiness around me as the front of the train came into view. I quickened my pace and went up to the window where the driver should be. There was not a soul inside. It looked just as plain and new as the rest of the train had been. I turned to see my surroundings and looked up. There I saw a large dark green sign that read, Cameron Square. Where the hell is Cameron Square? I thought, turning to take a look at the large room in front of me. There were no other signs or maps to guide me. Upon further investigation, it wasn't a one-way station. There were tracks on the other side. I ran to my left, where I hadn't seen a small staircase poking behind the center wall towards the back of where I had entered. I ran up to the stairs and looked up. There was nothing but a black void in front of me. As if it had contemplated the decision for me, the familiar slam of doors and the screech of a leaving train brought me back to my senses. I spun around only to see the train pulling out from the station. There was nothing to think about now. The dull echo of my footsteps surrounding me as I made my way up the flight of stairs. I reached the top and stepped out. It was spacious and held the same familiar look of the entrance to any other New York station. Turnstiles to the front of me and a booth with 4 windows next to it. A few more steps did nothing but make me feel even more isolated. There hung large empty frames where posters of local shows should be, or maybe some sort of corporate advertisement. After stepping over the cold metal bars of the turnstiles, there appeared to be no exit in sight. I started to walk around the space, at this point not entirely sure of what I was now looking for. I glanced to the farthermost corner of the room from where I was standing, only to see the outline of a human figure pressed up against the wall. I stood completely still, squinting my eyes to make sure I wasn't imagining what I was seeing. I was frozen in a state of terror. I held my ground for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Suddenly, the large rumbling of an approaching train met my ears, and relief flooded over me as I realized that now I had a way out. I calculated a plan that once the train arrived, I'd wait about 20 seconds before turning and sprinting down the stairs towards it. Until then, I would just have to stay there, as still as possible. The figure didn't make a single move, but as I continued to concentrate my eyes on them, I made out that they were definitely wearing a hood over their head, and I noticed the clear shape of two shoes poking out from under their long pants. The train screeched, and the pound sound of open doors echoed up towards me, signaling the train doors had now opened. I had no idea if what was in front of me was actually dangerous, but I knew I didn't want any confrontation with it. Whoever they were, I was sure they weren't there to help me. After 20 seconds, or what felt like it, I turned and sprinted towards the turnstiles at full speed, leaping over them and running down the long flight of stairs. Not but a moment after I had started running, the heavy sound of what I took to be heavy boots began behind me. I had just reached the final landing, right before the final few steps of the stairs, when I noticed the footsteps had gotten a lot closer. I continued to run towards the train that was on the opposite tracks of where I had first entered. I bounded into the cabin and turned to see the same figure, now clearly showing the resemblance of a man, charging towards me, fists clenched. He was probably 2 steps away from making his way inside, but just before he would be able to jump in, the doors slammed shut in his face. He wasted no time in turning and running back to where he came. I stood there panting and watched him until he was out of my sight. A moment later, the train jolted forward and increased in speed, and I collapsed onto a plastic chair. My legs sprawled out, trying to calm myself as the strong kick of adrenaline left my body. Strangely, I felt a strong feeling of tiredness and soon found myself struggling to keep my eyes open before giving up and letting the darkness consume me. I awoke to a young woman waving her hand over my face. I sat up and she told me that I had been knocked out the duration of her trip, and she thought something might be wrong. I thanked her, but assured her I was quite all right. Before she left the open train doors, I asked her if she had ever heard of Cameron Station. She gave me a funny look and told me she hadn't. I struggled to my feet and dodged my way out of the open doors onto the crowded station of 42nd Street and Bryant Park. Everything was how it should be. Benches full, a crowd making their way down the stairs, and even more pushing their way onto the train. The experience I just had lingered with me even in the busy station, the terror still weighing on me. That's the story of why I don't ride the subway anymore. A wholesome experience. I wrote this out for a ghost story thread on a friend's Facebook and thought I'd share it here as well. I'm going to share my most wholesome experience. My great aunt lived in an historic house on 80 acres of land in upstate New York. The house had even been declared a landmark by the state, with a plaque that claimed the house had been built in 1640. The summer when I was 10 years old, I stayed with my grandparents, whose property was adjacent to my great-aunt Ivysaur. It was about a quarter-mile hike to get to our house from theirs. Ivysaur invited me to stay the night with her one time, but she warned me that she had a ghost in her upstairs who loved children, so I was likely to get a visit. I thought she was messing with my head and didn't think much of it. She set me up in one of her upstairs guest rooms, just down the hall from her bedroom. I had settled in and gone to sleep. Deep in the night, I have no idea what time, I awoke to a soft glow in the hallway under the door of my room, and the sound of soft footfalls creaking in the hall outside. At first I thought it was my aunt, but the steps kept pacing back and forth, and the soft glow was moving with the footsteps, up and down the hall. I began to get nervous, remembering I's warning about the ghost. I turned over in bed so that I couldn't see the moving glow in the hall, and looked out the window next to my bed, trying to ignore the footsteps, and fell asleep again. A while later, I awoke to my bedroom door creaking open, and my room was lit by that soft glow, like someone had come in carrying a candle. I felt a cold chill on my back and tensed up with fear, shutting my eyes tight. I felt a gentle hand begin to stroke my hair away from my face. I thought maybe it was I, so I opened my eyes and looked around. The room is lit with the candlelight glow, but there is no visible source. I lay back down, eyes squeezed shut tight. The sensation of the hand stroking my head comes back, and I hear a gentle shh. Then I feel a soft kiss on my forehead, and I was filled with this deep sense of love and peace. The glow left the room, and I was able to fall asleep right away. I stayed over with I a couple of other times during that summer, and would hear the footsteps in the hall and see the soft glow that went with them in the hall each time. But she never came into my room again that I was aware of. I think she didn't want to scare me. Camp Turk, Upstate, New York. Many years ago, I was working as a camp counselor at Camp Turk in Upstate, New York, very close to Old Forge. This was a camp run by the Freemasonry for underprivileged kids in New York City. I had several very strange experiences. In the main bunkhouse, which was suspended on legs and built into the hill, was where I stayed most of the time at the camp. This was an old building from the 1920s, and I had heard was the ward for the orphanage which previously stood there. Feelings from being watched in the cracks in the walls. Disembodied voices calling the campers into the toilets late at night. This happened on 2 occasions with different groups of kids who didn't know each other. One case of a kid growling and seemingly being possessed, and another, in the middle of the night, we heard this faint noise and found him once out of bed, standing in the middle of the room, staring at another kid in the darkness, grinding his teeth. It took us several minutes to break him from the spell. Several kids reported seeing a nurse walking around in the night. There wasn't one there. In general, the whole camp had an extremely creepy vibe. Haunted Asylum in New York State. This past Halloween, 2021, me and my fiancé wanted to explore a real haunted building. I honestly wasn't expecting to have any weird experiences and went in being skeptical. We booked ahead of time, and I think there was a group of 20 or so people we didn't know. They gave us the history of the place and the rules and said, go look around. There wasn't a guided tour at all, just kind of a do-your-own thing. The place was super creepy, and I felt like I got weird vibes because of that. However, we went to the 2nd floor, and I was walking past this tiny room that they probably used to store medication. I went to walk into the room. The mirror was broken, and I got really lightheaded and had an instant headache. I felt almost like not myself for about 30 seconds and walked out into another room. As soon as I left, the feelings went away. Like 5 minutes later, my fiancé said she had the same thing happen before I even mentioned it. We ended up standing in the hallway, and I was just recording with my phone. I'd say maybe 15 minutes went by with nothing, but then I felt this electricity from my feet course through my body to my hands, holding my phone, and it felt like an unseen force went to push my phone away. I wish I could have captured an EVP or some gnarly video, but I didn't. Anyone else check out a haunted place like this and have any experiences? The friendly ghost of my childhood home. I was born in Whitesboro, New York. Now, admittedly, I was too young to remember any of this, but my parents and older sister told me about these things. While we were there, my parents would hear footsteps going up and down the stairs. They would hear knocking and could hear whispers. They always told me that the ghost, or whatever it was, never did anything to harm or scare, besides hearing stuff that wasn't there. My sister said that whenever she would hear the ghost coming down the hallway, she would say hello, and sometimes she would feel like a loving or calming presence when she thought it was present. I'm not sure if they were ever touched or saw anything move. This next part may sound weird, but my parents say that when they were renovating the house, they took down a wall to open up a room in the house. They found a picture of an elderly lady in the wall. Kind of creepily, my parents tell me when they put the wall back up, they put a family picture of us in the wall. This event took place a long time ago. I am now 21 years old, and we lived at that house for 8 years, but I only lived there for 2 to 3 years before we moved out. Woken up in the middle of the night during the 2003 NYC Blackout. I don't know how many of you will remember this, but in the summer of 2003, there were widespread power outages in the northeast region of the United States, plus parts of Canada. I was 11 years old and was living with my grandma in an old suburb of Staten Island, New York. Because of this story, I'll always distinctly remember those 2 to 3 days without power. At the time, my family had just recently moved into a new house and had probably only been there for a few months. The house was old, probably built in the early to mid-1900s. As soon as we moved in, we immediately felt something in the house. Cold spots, random noises, shadows, voices, etc. We realized that the house was haunted, but we never really felt that we had to leave because of it. My grandma and mom are sensitive to spirits, and we'd lived in other haunted houses before, so we were kind of used to it. Our ancestral house in the Philippines was much worse, so we really weren't in a rush to move so quickly after just moving in. In this house, I only ever saw shadows and heard voices, while my grandma and mom saw full-body apparitions, that is, until the blackout happened. So one night during the blackout, it was hot as hell. The temperature was probably in the high 80s and low 90s, with no air conditioning due to the power outages. So I asked my grandmother if I could sleep in her room, since it was on the 3rd floor in the coolest part of the house. She obliged, and I fell asleep next to my grandmother after playing Pokemon on my Game Boy under the covers for a few hours. I was woken up by a strange noise in the middle of the night, a few hours later, probably around 1 or 2 a.m. It was freezing cold, so cold that I forgot about the power outage and thought that the AC was on. The noise sounded like a distant wailing, kind of like really high-pitched police sirens, if it was a block away. It was loud enough to wake me, but somehow still sounded really far away. At this point, I'm not really thinking much of it, since a window was open, and I assumed the noise was coming from outside. I'm still under the covers and wide awake, so I grab my Game Boy and start playing Pokemon in silence, so that I don't wake my grandmother. I was obsessed with the game. As I'm playing, I notice the noise getting louder and closer. This continued for another minute or so until I start to get really annoyed. Just as I was about to pull the covers off to investigate, I feel a weight shift on the bed and hear the mattress springs squeak by the foot of the bed. I look over to check if my grandma was still there or if she somehow left without me knowing. She didn't. She was still there. I slowly peek out from under the covers and see a pale-skinned woman with long dark hair sitting by the foot of the bed. She was wearing a light-colored dress and faced towards the wall. Her hands were pressed against her face and eyes, and she was crying, which I now realize is the noise I had been hearing. I was terrified and shaking, so I turned to wake my grandmother, but I realized she's already sitting up and praying the rosary in silence. She then turned to me and said, "Don't worry, she won't hurt you. She visits me every night." I'll never forget it. I was freaked out and just shut my eyes until I fell back asleep. Anyways, after that night, I never slept in my grandmother's room again. I continued to feel a presence in the house, but I never heard the wailing or saw the woman again. My grandmother, on the other hand, said that the woman continued her nightly visits until we moved a year later. The active crumbling of society. The music began to ring out through the city. I slid the glass door and looked off the balcony. New York City seemed to halt. The cars along the road unprecedentedly stopped. The hustling population stopped and stared, as well as the surplus homeless, and the advertisement displayed on the wall hushed, replacing itself with a monotonous timer counting down from 120, highlighted by the distinct American flag in the background. The national anthem, a song that represented the unity of the USA, now flooded the streets of New York City. It was scratchy and loud. It sounded as if it was playing through some sort of ancient gramophone. The tune was broken by a voice, robotic in nature. "Good morning, American citizens. The CDC, National Center of Chronic Disease Control and Prevention, regrets to inform you that this area is grounds for a mass extermination due to a selection of the population observed to possess a dangerous pathogen. The symptoms of this pathogen include extreme nausea, insatiable hunger, cannibalism, severe necrosis, skin hemorrhaging." The music rang louder and became more irritating, as if they were attempting to drown out everyone's worry with the unifying patriotic music. The timer still counted 59, 58, 57, 56. Severe cutaneous abscesses, osteoporosis, and eventually death. To prevent the further spread of this pathogen internationally, which will result in a world-threatening catastrophe, everyone hearing this message will be painlessly euthanized. You are advised to say goodbye to your loved ones in the time given. Any attempt of traveling away from the city will render said person a fugitive. If caught, said person is warranted for immediate termination. We are honored to serve our beautiful nation, and now, as American citizens, you should do your part and accept your fate. God bless America. Thank you, and good night. Sirens began to sound, accompanying the music, which was now essentially white noise. The city was now unfrozen. Everyone seemed to scramble, potentially to their loved ones. People held phones and sobbed. I closed the door and ran through my apartment and into my youngest's room. He was oblivious to his impending doom, though still hid due to the loud noises. "It's okay, Max. It's okay. Come here." He ran to me and embraced me. I looked to my right. My eldest emerged from his room. He was much more aware. I could tell he knew what was coming, as he wiped his tears and embraced me as well. I could tell the hug was genuine, spawned from fear. I looked past my sons and through the window. I could see many helicopters pass by. "Kids, stay in your rooms. I need to check something, all right?" I told them. They obliged. I ran back to my balcony. The timers turned red and flashed the number 0. As the national anthem concluded, I looked beyond the buildings. To my horror, the horizon was plagued with a yellow-green tinted cloud that was slowly moving my way. Tale of a New York subway. A girl named Laura was traveling back to her apartment from work late at night in New York City. She was a little nervous about taking the subway so late at night, but she figured that there would probably not be many people riding it, so she decided to forego a cab and take the subway anyway. When she got on the subway, she was surprised to see that there were in fact 3 people already sitting there. 2 large suited men in dark sunglasses, and a little girl in between them. Laura was surprised to see such a young girl on the subway at this time of night, but based on how she was dressed and her designer sunglasses, Laura figured the suited men were escorts or bodyguards for the daughter of someone wealthy. Laura took her seat across from the trio. If anybody else gave her trouble, she was sure the strong men would help her out. At the next stop, a man in his late 20s or early 30s got onto the subway at the other end of the car from Laura. He was clearly very, very tired and quite unkempt. His shirt was wrinkled and definitely not clean, and he had what looked like a few days' worth of stubble. The man was exactly the type of individual Laura hoped to avoid on her ride home. But the bedraggled figure was certainly no match for the men who sat across from her. As the subway moved on, though, Laura noticed something very odd. The man at the other end of the car would glance up, look slowly at Laura, then at the men, then at the girl, and back to Laura. He did this several times before the next stop, at which point he got up and moved a few seats closer to Laura, the men, and the little girl. Understandably nervous at this point, Laura was still confident the suited men could fight off the creep. However, the men didn't move, even as the homeless-looking man repeated the process of looking at the other passengers before moving a few seats down. After several stops, he was seated almost right next to Laura, and yet she was the only one who seemed to be bothered. The suited man and the girl stayed put. Laura's heart pounded as she counted 2 more stops until her apartment. How much closer would the suited men allow the threat to go? With dread, Laura realized the subway was closing, and it approached the next station. The instant the doors opened, the sketchy man grabbed her around the waist and carried Laura, screaming, out of the subway. The man ran with Laura over his shoulder as fast as he could, visions of being robbed or murdered flashing through her mind. Eventually, the man set her down. He was panting. He quickly gasped, "Ma'am, I need you to calm down. My name is John. I'm a student at Columbia Medical School. I work with cadavers all day. And I guarantee that that little girl was not alive." Thank you so much for joining me. Now don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.